In the 5th century before Common Era, BCE, Athens was at the heart of a cultural and political golden age. Victorious from the Persian Wars, the city dominated the Aegean Sea and became the intellectual, artistic, and political capital of the Greek world. Under the leadership of Pericles, Athenian democracy flourished, and the arts and philosophy thrived. However, this prosperity was followed by severe turmoil. The long Peloponnesian War between Athens and Sparta, which took place between 431 and 404 before Common Era, exhausted Athens. In 404 BCE, defeated, the city lost its freedom and suffered a brutal oligarchic regime imposed by Sparta. An aristocratic junta, called the 30 Tyrants, seized power and instilled terror. Among these oligarchs was Critias, the maternal uncle of Plato. The following year, democracy was restored, but Athens remained divided and weakened. It was in this turbulent and unstable context that, in 427 before Common Era, Plato was born, heir to a great Athenian aristocratic family. Plato, born around 428 to 427. Before Common Era in Athens, came from nobility. Initially, he bore the name Aristocles, but his gymnastics teacher soon gave him the nickname Plato, derived from the Greek platis, meaning broad, in reference to his broad shoulders. In his youth, the future philosopher received a meticulous education, steeped in classical Greek culture. He studied poetry, music, grammar, gymnastics, and mathematics, familiarizing himself with the great literary works and thought of his time. This young aristocrat also showed an early interest in the politics of his city. Despite the turmoil, Athens remained an intellectual hub where new currents of thought emerged. Plato thus grew up in a world where the tragedies of Sophocles, the debates of the sophists, and philosophical discussions animated cultural life. This versatile education and vibrant environment prepared the ground for his philosophical vocation. Around 407 BCE, at the age of about 20, Plato had an encounter that would change his life. He became a student of the famous philosopher Socrates, then in his 60s. Socrates, with his method based on incessant questioning and the pursuit of moral truth, fascinated the young man. For 8 years, Plato frequented this charismatic master daily. He abandoned his initial literary ambitions, having once considered becoming a poet or statesman, to devote himself entirely to philosophy under Socrates' influence. This period of Socratic formation profoundly marked Plato. He learned the art of dialogue, the demand for precise definition of concepts, and the primacy of a virtuous life. Socrates instilled in him the importance of distinguishing opinion from true knowledge and always questioning received ideas. Throughout his life, Plato maintained unwavering admiration and loyalty to Socrates, often making him the central character in his philosophical dialogues. Under Socrates' guidance, his thought took shape, centered on the pursuit of good, justice, and truth. In 399 BCE, Plato witnessed a tragic event that shook his deepest convictions. That year, his master Socrates was accused of impiety by the Athenian authorities. He was accused of corrupting the youth and not honoring the city's gods. At the end of a resounding trial, Socrates was sentenced to death and forced to drink hemlock, a liquid that quickly ends life. Plato, then in his 20s, was devastated by the execution of this sage, whom he considered the most eminent man of his time. He could not attend Socrates' final moments, having fallen ill that day, as he himself reports in the dialogue Phaedo. The unjust death of Socrates, decided by a democratic tribunal, was a trauma for Plato. It represented for him the experience of injustice itself, a foundational event from which he oriented all his future reflection. Plato became aware of the possible deviations of politics and the fragility of justice under the Athenian democratic regime. The shock of this infamous condemnation turned him away from the idea of engaging in the city's active politics and convinced him that philosophy must seek to understand how to establish true justice to avoid such dramas. A few months after Socrates' death, Plato and other disciples of the master left Athens with heavy hearts, determined to continue his work of thought in a more favorable environment. Following Socrates' disappearance, Plato embarked on a long period of travel that would enrich his intellectual formation and forge his own philosophy. He first took refuge in Megara, a neighboring city of Athens, with other Socratics. There, he joined Euclid of Megara, a former student of Socrates, and continued with him the philosophical discussions initiated with the master. This stay allowed him to remain surrounded by people sharing the Socratic heritage while gaining perspective on Athens. Plato then broadened his horizons. According to tradition, he went to Egypt, a land of ancient knowledge, where he became interested in the knowledge of Egyptian priests and mathematics. He also traveled to Cyrene in North Africa, where he met the mathematician Theodorus of Cyrene, as well as Aristippus, a philosopher and disciple of Socrates established there. In contact with these scholars, Plato deepened his understanding of various fields such as geometry and discovered other philosophical approaches. These experiences reinforced in him the conviction that mathematics and exact sciences are essential tools for accessing knowledge and training the mind in rigor, an idea he would later integrate into the curriculum for training philosophers. His journey then led him to Magna Graecia, that is, the Greek colonies of southern Italy. There, he particularly sought to meet the philosophers of the Pythagorean school. In Tarentum, he met Archytas, a famous Pythagorean who led the city and was known for attempting to establish a government enlightened by philosophy. This encounter was important, as it showed Plato a concrete example of leaders applying philosophical principles to political power. The Pythagoreans, with their ideas about numbers, the harmony of the soul, and the transmigration of souls, also influenced Plato, particularly in his conception of the immortality of the soul and the cosmic order. Finally, Plato went to Sicily, attracted by the fame of the powerful city of Syracuse. In 388 BCE, he was invited to the court of Dionysius the Elder, the autocratic tyrant of Syracuse. Plato, perhaps idealizing the figure of the philosopher king, hoped to convince this ruler to moderate his power through philosophical wisdom. However, the experience turned sour. The debauched and violent court life in Syracuse shocked the philosopher. His advice on virtuous governance displeased the tyrant. Soon, conflict erupted between the two men. Dionysius, irritated by the frankness and lessons of his guest, decided to get rid of him. Plato was expelled from Syracuse and forcibly put on a ship. Worse, during a stopover, he was sold as a slave on the island of Aegina, an enemy of Athens. This misadventure could have tragically sealed his fate. Fortunately, a wealthy friend named Anicaris, whom he had met in Cyrene, bought him and restored his freedom. Tested but unharmed, Plato returned to Athens around 387 BCE. These sometimes perilous travels had given him the opportunity to confront his ideas with other traditions, and to test his theories concretely against the reality of power. The failure of his attempt to convert Dionysius the Elder to philosophy had shown him, in particular, how difficult it is to align the ideals of the sage with the intrigues of established power. Back in his homeland after many years of wandering, Plato was about 40 years old. Strengthened by his learnings and driven by his experiences, he decided to settle in Athens and devote himself fully to the transmission of knowledge. Around 387 BCE, he acquired a gymnasium and a garden located in the domain of Academus at the gates of Athens, and founded his own school, the Academy. It was the first philosophical institution of antiquity whose existence is well historically attested. Plato's Academy functioned somewhat like a school or a circle of advanced studies. There, not only philosophy was taught, but also sciences, particularly mathematics, as well as gymnastics. Plato was convinced that disciplines like geometry prepared the mind for abstract thought and the pursuit of truth. Within the academy, teaching was mainly conducted through lively discussions and debates of ideas, reflecting the legacy of the Socratic method. Plato engaged in dialogue with his students, questioning them, pushing them to define terms and examine problems from all angles. This interactive approach explains why he favored the genre of dialogue in his philosophical writings. The school quickly attracted brilliant minds from all over the Greek world. Among the students who followed his teaching was a young man destined to make his mark on the history of thought, Aristotle. Arriving at the academy around 367 BCE, Aristotle studied with Plato for about 20 years. He became the most accomplished student of the school, to the point that it was later said he was the only one truly able to rival the master. The presence of Aristotle illustrated the intellectual influence of the academy, which would remain a major center of knowledge for centuries. Plato led the academy for the rest of his life, making it the crucible where the ideas that would nourish his works and form the next generation of philosophers were forged. Settled in the academy, Plato also devoted himself to writing his philosophical works, most of which took the form of dialogues. These dialogues often featured Socrates discussing with various figures, pursuing the ideal of the common quest for truth. Plato produced about 20 dialogues covering almost all fields of philosophy: politics, ethics, knowledge, metaphysics, aesthetics, and so on. These writings can be roughly classified by period, reflecting the evolution of his thought over time. In the early dialogues, known as Socratic dialogues, Plato mainly reported the discussions and ideas of Socrates. It was his way of paying tribute to his master and preserving his teachings. Among these is the Apology of Socrates, where Plato transcribes the defense speech delivered by Socrates during his trial in 399 BCE. This moving text is a direct testimony to the nobility of Socrates' soul in the face of his judges. One can feel Plato's indignation at the injustice suffered by his mentor. Another dialogue from this period, Crito, depicts Socrates in prison, refusing to escape and discussing the respect for laws and justice, reflecting the philosopher's moral integrity until the end. Phaedo, on the other hand, recounts the last hours of Socrates and focuses on demonstrating the immortality of the soul. In it, Socrates calmly dialogues about life after death with his disciples before drinking the hemlock. This dialogue offers a profound meditation on the duality of body and soul and the hope of an existence of the soul beyond death. Plato's mature dialogues correspond to the peak of his thought and include his most famous works. One of the most important is The Republic, written probably in the 370s BCE. This vast work in 10 books is dedicated to defining justice and constructing an ideal city. Plato details the education of future rulers and describes what a perfectly just society would look like. It is in The Republic that he formulates his famous project of the philosopher king, and where he introduces striking images such as the allegory of the cave. In this allegory, he compares humanity to prisoners chained in a cave who take the shadows projected on the wall for reality. One of the captives manages to free himself and step into the open air. Initially dazzled, he discovers the true world illuminated by the sun, symbolizing the good and truth. When he returns to the cave to try to enlighten the others, they refuse to believe him, clinging to their illusions. Through this powerful metaphorical story, Plato illustrates the difficult path from ignorance to knowledge, as well as the mission of the philosopher, who, having seen the light of truth, must guide his fellow humans, even against their will. The Republic remains one of the most influential philosophical texts, posing timeless questions about social justice, knowledge, and power. Another major dialogue from this period, The Symposium, is dedicated to the theme of love. In the setting of a banquet in Athens, several characters, including the poet Aristophanes and the playwright Agathon, each give a speech in praise of love. Plato, through the voice of Socrates and the character of Diotima, develops the idea that love, eros, is an impulse that allows one to reach absolute beauty. True love, beyond physical attraction, elevates the soul from the particular to the universal, from the beautiful body to the idea of beauty itself. The Symposium thus shows the philosophical importance of the pursuit of beauty and the inner transformation that love implies. This dialogue combines conceptual depth and poetic richness, and is often cited for its theory of Platonic love. Other notable dialogues include Phaedrus, which also deals with love and the reminiscence of the soul, Theaetetus, on knowledge, and Parmenides, which questions the theory of ideas itself. Towards the end of his life, Plato wrote more difficult and technical dialogues such as The Sophist and Timaeus, where he proposed a cosmology, an explanation of the creation of the world. His last work, The Laws, left unfinished, is a more pragmatic treatise on politics, where he describes the laws of a second ideal city, less perfect than that of the Republic, but more achievable. The entirety of these works, with their encyclopedic scope, has made Plato one of the pillars of Western philosophy. The execution of Socrates and the political disorders that Plato witnessed strongly influenced his political thought. Having seen Athens transition from the enlightened democracy of Pericles to demagoguery and oligarchic tyranny, Plato developed a severe critique of the governments of his time, particularly the Athenian democracy as it functioned after the Peloponnesian War. In his writings, he expressed his disappointment with direct democracy, which he accused of easily falling into demagoguery, the government by flattery of the people. He observed that under democratic leaders, unbridled freedom could lead to chaos, that skillful orators manipulated the crowd, and that public decisions often lacked wisdom and justice. The death of Socrates was, for him, the most glaring proof of this. How could a city claiming to be civilized condemn a just man based on false accusations? This realization of failure led him to question the foundations of the Athenian political system. Plato did not spare other forms of government of his time either. He had experienced the brutal oligarchy of the 30 tyrants, of which his own uncle was a part, and abhorred the tyranny and corruption of power by a minority. In The Republic, he reviewed various regimes: timocracy, oligarchy, democracy, tyranny, and showed their deviations. According to him, all these systems were doomed to injustice if those who governed sought primarily their personal interests or succumbed to passions instead of pursuing the common good. Plato believed that the political crises of Athens stemmed from a moral decline. He had seen leaders, whether conservative aristocrats or democrats, prioritize power and wealth over justice and truth. He denounced politicians who flattered the people instead of guiding them, and the transformation of freedom into license, where everyone did as they pleased without regard for order and the public good. Faced with this grim picture, Plato dedicated his life to reflecting on the conditions of a just and harmonious city. His ambition was to define an ideal political model that would avoid the errors he had observed. His political philosophy sought to profoundly reform the conception of power. For him, the key lay in the virtue and knowledge of those who governed. This is where his innovative concept, which contrasted with the practices of his century, comes into play, that of the philosopher king. To put an end to the corruption and incompetence of leaders, Plato proposed in The Republic a radical idea: to entrust power to philosophers, that is, to sages trained over many years in the pursuit of truth and the good. He asserted that the ills of cities would cease only when philosophers became kings or kings became philosophers. This project of the philosopher king stemmed from his conviction that only someone who had attained authentic knowledge of the good and justice was fit to guide the city towards common happiness. In his ideal, rulers would no longer be ambitious individuals seeking prestige or wealth, but enlightened minds who had purified their souls of selfishness and base desires to devote themselves to the service of the community. Plato conceived this ideal government as a form of aristocracy, not based on birth or wealth, but on virtue and knowledge. Only a small number of exceptionally wise and morally upright men and women would exercise power, supported by a demanding educational system that would train future guardians of the city from childhood. In this just city, each social class, the philosopher rulers, the auxiliary warriors, and the producers, would occupy the place corresponding to their nature and competence, in harmony according to the principle of justice understood as the balanced order, where each does what they are most qualified for. Plato insisted on the necessity of thorough education for the city's guardians. A long curriculum of moral, intellectual, and physical training, detailed in The Republic, was to enable them to develop a righteous soul. These philosopher rulers, having contemplated the truth, would be immune to the temptations of demagoguery and tyranny. At the foundation of this political ideal lies Plato's famous theory of ideas. Indeed, to truly know what justice, the good, or virtue is, and therefore to be able to apply them in the city, one must have absolute knowledge of them. According to Plato, these notions exist in the form of pure, perfect, and eternal ideas in a higher realm of reality. The theory of ideas or forms asserts that beyond the sensible world we perceive with our senses, a changing and imperfect world, exists an intelligible, immutable world made of absolute essences. For example, all the just things we see are only approximations of the idea of justice itself, which alone is perfect justice. The same goes for beauty, courage, the good, etc. The philosopher is the one who, through their rational soul, manages to rise above sensible appearances, to contemplate these true ideas. This process is what Plato calls dialectic. The soul, guided by reason, gradually abstracts itself from the changing material world to reach eternal truths. This conversion of the soul towards the intelligible is compared to an awakening, a departure from the cave towards the light. Through the knowledge of ideas, the soul approaches the supreme good, which is the idea that crowns all others, often symbolized by the sun in the Republic. Thus, for Plato, a philosopher king would be someone who has completed this intellectual and moral journey to the end. Having known the truth of the good, they could apply it in politics. Conversely, Plato categorically rejected the idea of entrusting power to ignorant people or those dominated by their passions. He saw in tyranny the reign of a soul perverted by its desires, and in unbridled democracy the reign of a multitude without true knowledge, ready to be seduced by flatterers. His philosopher king is the antidote to these excesses, a leader who, master of themselves, just and enlightened, would prioritize the common good over their own interests. Although this ideal may seem utopian, it has the merit, according to Plato, of setting a horizon towards which to strive. The Republic is not so much a concrete plan to reform Athens as a philosophical model for thinking about politics in a demanding and moral way. This ideal of government by the wise has profoundly marked the Western political imagination. It has inspired many thinkers throughout the ages and sparked endless debates about the place of intellectuals and philosophers in the city. Plato led the academy until the end of his life, forming several generations of students. Aristotle, his most illustrious disciple, eventually left the school shortly after Plato's death to establish his own institution, the Lyceum, and develop his own philosophy. While Aristotle drew inspiration from many of his master's teachings, he also diverged on several points, criticizing, for example, the theory of ideas, and proposing a more empirical approach grounded in the observation of the concrete world. Nevertheless, without Plato's initial impetus, Aristotle's thought might not have taken the same course. The student and the master are inseparable in the history of philosophy. Plato passed away around 348 to 347 BCE at the age of approximately 80, likely in Athens, surrounded by his students. According to some anecdotes, he died peacefully in his sleep, or even during a wedding banquet, according to a later legend, but the details of his death remain uncertain. What is certain is that the legacy he left behind is immense. His nephew Speusippus succeeded him as head of the academy, continuing his uncle's teachings. The Platonic Academy continued to exist for several centuries, going through different phases, the Old, Middle, and New Academy, adapting Plato's thought to new contexts. Beyond his school, the legacy of Plato's philosophy is considerable. Already in antiquity, his ideas gave rise to movements such as Neoplatonism. In the 3rd century CE, Plotinus took up and transformed Platonic metaphysics, emphasizing the one and the world soul. Platonism strongly influenced the thought of Christian philosophers and theologians like St. Augustine, who drew from it the notion of a divine, intelligible world and the primacy of the soul. In the Middle Ages, the direct influence of Plato waned in favor of Aristotle, who was more commented upon by the scholastics, but some of his ideas survived through Boethius or Arab authors. During the Renaissance, Plato returned to the forefront of the European intellectual scene. In Florence, humanists like Marsilio Ficino translated his works into Latin and founded a new Platonic academy, reviving the spirit of his teachings. His exaltation of divine love, beauty, and intellectual pursuit captivated the thinkers of the time. The following centuries continued to rediscover Plato from various angles, whether it was the 17th century philosophers like Descartes, who inherited in part his conception of the duality of soul and body, the 19th century with German neo-idealism, or the 20th century, where thinkers like Whitehead and Popper still discussed his political ideas, all engaged in their own way with the giant of the academy. It has been said that all of Western philosophy is but a series of footnotes to Plato's pages. This formula, attributed to philosopher Alfred North Whitehead, underscores how Plato posed the fundamental questions that thinkers after him have not ceased to comment on, critique, or deepen. More than 2 millennia after his death, Plato remains an inexhaustible source of inspiration. His work, with its myths, the cave, the androgynous, the charioteer of the soul, its dialogues populated with vibrant characters, and its bold theories on ideas, knowledge, and the ideal city, continue to be read, studied, and questioned. Whether reflecting on justice, love, truth, or the nature of reality, we constantly return to the insights of the philosopher from Athens. Plato's legacy is, above all, having made philosophy a living adventure, where thought and life intertwine, and having shown that the pursuit of wisdom can transform not only the individual, but also society as a whole.